Hi everyone, welcome to Type Talks. Today we have Ren, and he has a fantastic YouTube channel that I'll have linked below. And he's also released the book, The Ecstatic Soul, and it is a great deep dive into the INFJ personality type. And it's extremely philosophical. So if you love philosophy and you want to see its intersection with typology, I would highly recommend this book. You will really explore the depths of the INFJ personality through a very philosophical presentation. And so before we dive into the book, I'm wondering, Ren, if you could tell us a bit about you.
Hi, Joyce. It's good to be here. It's good to be on this channel. It's been overdue, I think. Some people might know about me, some people might not. I have a YouTube channel where for the last few years I've been discussing mostly INFJ things, and it is true that I think I tend to approach INFJ topics, sometimes topics beyond the INFJ type, more specific, more broadly typology, from a philosophical perspective, through a philosophical lens, because it's part of my temperament. It's also part of my training. And so when I created the channel, which is called Renaud Contini, it's just my name, so thank you for linking it, I appreciate that. I thought, okay, first of all, what interests me, what am I into, that would motivate me enough to make videos and to sound at least halfway compelling when I'm talking about these topics. And also, what could be my angle? What could make me, I suppose, from a sort of perspective of wanting to grow my channel, I thought to myself, what could make me stand out a little bit? What could attract a particular kind of audience, and they would know my channel, because my channel is where INFJ is discussed through a lens that perhaps I'm the only one to do exactly like that, which is invoking a lot of philosophy, or not necessarily name dropping of philosophers, but just approaching these topics, including the topic of the INFJ philosophically. In terms of my broader backgrounds, I was born in France. I live in Ireland. I work in the charity sector at the moment. Academically, my background is in literature, history, and philosophy. And I'd say because I went quite far in my studies, I went all the way to do a doctorate. It probably really permeated into my presentation style and the way I think about things, for better or for worse. So based in Ireland, and I love that country. I kind of feel at home, and in my spare time, I try to find the time to write books. So The Ecstatic Soul is the latest, and hopefully there will be more to come.
Yeah, I'm excited to read each and every one of your books coming up as well. I'm sure they're going to be as equally fabulous as this one that I read that you wrote. And so something really fascinating that Ren talks about in his book, The Ecstatic Soul, is the concept of existential alienation, and how INFJs have a very unique relationship with feeling alienated to the world. And so I was wondering if you could go a little bit into that.
Sure. I believe that the concept of existential alienation is it's chapter 1. So this is 6 chapters, introduction, and 6 chapters. Existential alienation is here. So what does that mean? So there's an argument to the extent that existential alienation is not just something that it's not just a state that a person would find themselves in. Of course, anyone is susceptible of feeling alienated in a particular situation. Maybe they're invited at a party and they don't know anyone, and they feel like the conversations are going above their heads, or maybe it's what they're saying that's going over people's heads. So that you could say, I'm feeling alienated in this particular situation. That can happen to any type. The existential alienation is meant to indicate a level of alienation that permeates the existence of a particular person. So it's actually a parameter of the very existence of someone. So it's not that the INFJ is a type that is susceptible to feeling alienated often or in a particular situation. Is that the very way in which we, let's say we, but INFJs relate to the world is through the lens of a fundamental type of alienation. And the the reason why I claim that, obviously it's based on some, it's not just philosophy, but it's also my observations about INFJs and the INFJ condition, and the observation of my own consciousness, the way I experience things in a sense. And I don't think that I conceal this in the book. Is I'm saying, this book is partly speculative, and it is an analysis of my own experience, but it has been validated, I think, by a lot of or corroborated by a lot of readers. And it's to say that among the 16 types, the INFJ type has a particular function stack, which is, let me get this right, NIFETISE, right? And this particular function stack comes with a particular qualitative experience of being in the world, of experiencing existence, experiencing life. It's not just, because I sometimes, what I'm a bit wary of is when people talk about types as if they're just this addition of different cognitive functions arranged in a stack, but we become somehow separated from like the experience, the qualitative experience of what it feels like to be an NI user or NI dominant, what it feels like to use FE as a kind of auxiliary support to NI, what it feels like to have TI, and so on. And so the existential alienation is this sense of finding it very difficult to be present, and always this feeling of being one step removed from the theater of events. Now we can go a bit further into the detail of it, but I just want to say at this point that it's not meant to be a value judgment. So in other words, it's not meant to be described as negative, even though it might look negative. That is to say, alienated. We hardly think about alienated as a positive term, but really, I do mean this in a neutral sense, in an analytical sense. I'm kind of like doing a diagnosis of the existential condition, but it's not meant to say if you're alienated, you're doing things wrong. I mean, I am saying in the book, there might be ways of developing yourself, but there's been plenty of alienated INFJs that have had perfectly okay lives. It's just an attempt to understand the INFJ condition better.
Well stated, Ren. And it does hold very true. There is a state of existential alienation just as a mode of being in the world. And you illustrate it really well in the arguments of feeling removed from the world due to two factors. And I'm totally forgetting them right now.
Take your time. It's a kind of dense, it's short but dense, right? I mean, that's how I would describe it. And that's what I was aiming for, like a format that would not intimidate people, because they think, okay, I can read this in a week, but like what you get, every page has something to say, you have to digest it. So don't worry, you can take your time.
Yeah, I do find INFJ writing to be very dense because it's very packed with the unpacking of a concept. And so you put a lot of thought and deliberation into it. And like people kind of have to reread certain parts to fully get it and soak it in because of how dense it is. But it's good. That means that it's super thoughtful, original, and it takes people a while to grasp it because it is so like it's a new kind of way of thinking. So people need to take a while to fully digest it to its fullest. but it's very deep and it's very rewarding to read. And so you talk about how the NI function and the FE function attribute to the INFJ experiencing a deep sense of alienation. The NI is very removed from the reality around them in the sense that it's never fully feeling like it's participating, but it's like observing in a certain way of reality. And so there's a detached observer element. And there's also the extroverted feeling element too that detaches INFJs more than their INTJ counterpart to the world almost. Because with the INTJ, they have TE attaching themselves to objects in the external world. Whereas INFJs, the object for their FE is people, and people contain their own form of subjectivity too. And so in a way, you're never truly connected to the outer world. You don't have a firm link to the outer world in any way because of that. And so I think that's a really wonderful breakdown there. And so another concept that you mentioned too is the cross between Jungian psychology and existential phenomenology. And so I'm wondering if you could go a little bit into that.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. But maybe I'll just say a few words about the INFJ function stack and the differences between INFJ and INTJ, and also the differences between INFJ, INTJ on the one hand and all the other 14 types. Because these are quite, I mean, you were very correct and very right to emphasize that this is an important argument early in the book. And in fact, in terms of getting to the stage where I distinguish between the objectification performed by extroverted thinking TE and the sense in which FE relates to people, not objects, I am actually quite happy that I kind of managed to clear that and to emphasize it, because I would argue it is partly missing in Jung, or at least it's only implicit in to some extent in the psychology of types. So I'm not saying that this book is better than Jung. I'm saying that I do think that in some respects it offers possible solutions to problems that were left unresolved in psychological types. So essentially, one of the arguments is for alienation, because so far, a listener or a viewer might think, okay, he's making this interesting point about alienation, but why should we believe him? Why should we believe that it's a specifically INFJ experience rather than INFP experience? I mean, a lot of people might think that INFPs are always talking about how they're alienated from the world. So the argument goes more or less like this. Is to say that if we look at all our functions, people have different function stacks. We can all agree on this. But there is one thing that everyone, regardless of type, has in common, is that they have an extroverted perceiving function somewhere, they have an extroverted judging function somewhere, they have an introverted perceiving function somewhere, and they have an introverted sensing function somewhere. So introverted judging function somewhere. So what I propose to do in the book is to categorize these four classes according to literally their function, not here function instead of cognitive function, when it serves what is the goal, what is the purpose, what does it serve. So I call extroverted perception gathering information. The function that it performs is to gather information in the external world by definition. Introverted perception is the processing of that information. Then introverted judgment is the parsing of that information and selecting most important and relevant bits. And then extroverted judgment is the presenting of the information and the justification. So we have these four different functions. Everybody has them. What distinguishes INJs and, in fact, ISJs is that their gathering function, in other words, their function of extroverted perception, is unconscious, at least according to the Jungian paradigm. It's the fourth function, it's the inferior function, therefore it's unconscious. Since it is unconscious, and since gathering is our point of entry to getting into contact with the external world, then we're unconsciously in contact with the external world, hence we're alienated in this existential sense. That's kind of the demonstration in its broad sense. I then suggest that in the case of the SI dominant types, ISTJ and ISFJ, the problem is not felt in as acute a manner because SI, among many functions that it operates, creates an internal map of the world. So as opposed to SE, gathering information and creating map-like relationship with the world, but literally through extroversion, SI produces an internal replica. And because it is an internal replica, it's also harder to update, which I suggest might explain why some SI types can be more conservative in terms of their worldviews, difficult to update once it's there, replicated. The difference between INFJ and INTJ then is that because their gathering functions unconscious, and NI does not provide a replica of the external world based on NE because both functions are fluid, so they cannot latch onto each other like that. Well, then it's exactly what you said. The function of extroverted judgment has to be used to get this access. With TE, you have an objectifying way of relating to the world. It's not through perception, but it's nevertheless available as a second step. With the INFJ, it's also available as a second step, but it's actually not directly latching onto objects. It's latching onto other subjectivities because it's a social function. It's an FE function. Subjectivities have themselves lives of their own, and they have their subjective states of their own. So there is a greater level of alienation, the greatest of all. So that's kind of a recapitulation of what I wanted to talk about. Now, in the case of your second question, which was bringing together, Jungian psychology and existentialism into what I call Jungian existentialism, and I call this book rather immodestly a manifesto, the first manifesto of Jungian existentialism, but I do take this point seriously. Essentially, I think that this is a great. It could potentially be my greatest insight in relation to this whole undertaking, because existentialism is all about trying to capture the qualia of consciousness. In other words, the qualitative states, how it feels to be in a particular state of consciousness or to just have a particular kind of consciousness. On the other hand, Jungian psychology, and particularly the cognitive function side of psychology, is meant to be a description of different types and helping to categorize different types. So you're always, in a sense, one step removed from the actual subjective experience of being a person of a certain type. And in existentialism, prior to the Ecstatic Soul, it's that one of the shortcomings, you could say, is that existentialism does explore the subjective qualitative experience of consciousness, of how it feels to be in a world, how it feels to be in a situation, how it feels to be in love, how it feels to be in a social group. But it tends to assume that there's only one type. So the insight of the book is to say, maybe there's 16 different qualitative experiences according to what type you are. And within each type, you'll have variations of qualitative experience because everyone is different, of course, but there'll be fundamental traits that each of these experiences have in common. So that's Jungian existentialism. In theory, there could be 16 books dedicated to 16 of the qualitative experiences of being of a type. And as far as I know, I'm the only person who's writing books about this. Hence why I have real belief in the future of Jungian existentialism. What I do not necessarily believe in is that I could be the one writing the 16 books, because there's a major limitation when it comes to not being of a type. Because how could I claim, for example, to write a book about the ISTP from a Jungian existentialist viewpoint when I'm really far from being an ISTP? So maybe I can literally not claim to know what the qualitative experience of having an ISTP consciousness is like. So ideally, I would like to inspire other people of other types to do the same thing, because I think that is probably the best approach. INFPs seem to be really interested in having a book written about them from that perspective. So it does say something about the INFP, INFJ common interests. It's tempting because I know a lot of INFPs very well, and I think in some senses it's probably the type I know best after INFJ. But there's always the quandary that I have to face, and it's a second-hand knowledge. It's not the qualitative first-hand knowledge. So anyway, that's a long answer to your great question.
That's one of the reasons why I like your book, because it's written from the mind of an INFJ and about how it feels like to be in your mind and how it's like to experience the world as an INFJ, as Ren, the INFJ. And that's needed because that's what creates the most visceral relatability in other people. Hearing about the functions, it's great and it helps people sort their type, but it's a little bit removed from what it means to be human. So when people write books about their own experience, it creates this connection point of making knowledge that also feels like you can see it on eye level almost. It's like taking Jungian knowledge and then being able to almost like share your life lens of that Jungian knowledge. There's one thing to hear about a type and the cognitive functions in a detached way, and it's another thing to actually read about it in a very viscerally, that's how it feels like to be you. And you're writing about the phenomenal, the phenomenal, the phenomenology that is going on inside your mind and how you actually see the world and how you experience it. And that gives people bigger knowledge into how it's like to be you. It creates empathy for the INFJ consciousness because people are like, that's how it's like to be an INFJ hovering through the world. And so it creates this level of people, like they get to understand INFJs beyond a surface level. They get to understand the essence of the INFJ, and you contribute to that. So it's great. You also talk about how it's great to have types writing about certain subjects from the lens of what it means, like how it is experienced through that type. And I think that's a great idea. And I'm actually doing that right now. So
Oh,
I'm going through each of the types, not on Jungian existentialism though.
that's okay. You do your thing, you know.
Yeah. So a book that's coming up later on in this year, by the end of this year, is an ISFP, how it's like to experience life as an ISFP book with
Can I have
ISFPs. Yeah, I'm writing it with some ISFPs, so that's
right?
how I'm doing it. Yeah.
That's brilliant.
And it's really good. When you get to experience how it's like to be in someone else's mind, it's like, wow, that's how it's like to be an ISFP. And it's like, phew. So I believe that your book gives that same mind blowing kind of sensation because people are like, wow, so that's how it's like to be Ren. Because you don't always explain to people, oh, I've experienced this existentialism within my day-to-day life. And then it's finally revealed. It's out of the closet. Your existentialism is out of the closet. And now it's
I
really giving people the chance to understand
no,
you.
thank you. If that's how you perceive this, I'm very glad because that was definitely the intention. Um, I'd say, I mean, I don't know about the ISFP project, how it will turn out. What I would say is, in terms of like the existentialism side of things, Jungian existentialism, and this is, I call it the manifesto of Jungian existentialism. Now, it's not out of a sense of, first of all, it's not only a sense of marketing, although it always helps. It's not out of a sense of self-importance. I would say not at all in this particular case. There's a precise sense in which I call this book a manifesto of Jungian existentialism, rather than just the first book of Jungian existentialism. And the reason why I think it's a manifesto is because I think that in addition to providing what you're talking about, what you described so well, which is the description of the qualitative INFJ conscious experience, which, by the way, can only really make sense and be validated if other INFJs read the book and say, that's exactly how I experience existence myself. And again, which seems to be the case. But the book is something in addition, and I wonder if you would agree. I think you would agree to this, which makes it a manifesto. It provides a template for how to isolate patterns. So it's not just a book about my experience of being an INFJ, because if that was just that, it wouldn't be as philosophical or as conceptual. It's also a book that essentially says, that's my consciousness. These are the parts of my conscious qualitative experience that are shared across INFJs. There's a difference between capturing the experience, the subjective experience, and capturing the form of the experience, which can be reiterated in other subjective experience by other INFJs. So, and that's what makes it a phenomenology, because if it was just a description of the phenomena, then I describe them, and it's not philosophical. But phenomenology is, in the sense, etymologically speaking, is the science of phenomena. So it's about finding the patterns, categorizing the patterns. And so alienation is an example, but there's lots of other examples in the book. So if readers are curious, they should get hold of the book. It's on Amazon. It's less than $10. I've advertised for this book so often at this point. But so yeah, it's a phenomenology. So it's both a description of my internal states and an analysis of the commonality of structures between the internal states of me as an INFJ and other INFJs. And I think that makes the book a manifesto in a sense, because it provides tools for other people to follow in the same tracks if they want to. Although, of course, they can bring their own approach to it. I don't mean for people to. In fact, the last chapter of the book is also suggesting possible further research paths for other people to explore. So I'm really not seeing this as just my kind of enterprise. Whether or not there will be people who kind of take a similar approach, I have no control over this, but I think it would be amazing if that was the case.
It is quite great. Yeah, you're taking the patterns of the INFJ experience and capturing it in a book. And yeah, you do a wonderful job of that. And I think that it is a very in-depth dive into...
It is quite in-depth. You know what? I don't know. Did you have a look at the Amazon page or the comments? Because when you're a writer, it's simply not true that you don't care about what people think. When your book comes out, Joyce, you'll experience that. I mean, you already experienced that with your channel. Like we don't like negative comments. It's just not true to say we're indifferent. We can learn to become more indifferent and to have a thicker shell. But no one is indifferent. In fact, if we were indifferent, we would not be motivated to create these things. So my book currently has like 4.5 stars out of 5. There's 43 reviews, which I think is really good. By the way, it's almost 1,000 copies sold. So very, very pleased with this. And April, it turns out, is going to have a bigger number of sales in March. So it's kind of like, it's not waning that much. It's kind of, but the negative reviews, 2 stars, there's like 2 or 3. They're basically saying this book is too complicated for me to read. So it's not so much it's a bad book. It's more like the reviewer was hoping for something easier to consume. So it's true, and if there's anyone among the viewers right now who's interested in maybe delving into this book, just be aware it's a book. Tell me if you agree with me, Joyce, but it's a book that demands of the reader commitments. You have to be focused. If you read it like a beach novel, you probably won't get much out of it.
I would agree. I feel like the INFJ writing style is generally dense.
Because the NI is a function that does a lot of processing of information, not unconsciously, because I disagree that this is unconscious, but at the back of consciousness, and there's a difference between both. It adds up a lot of information, and it kind of starts organizing it, even when we're not directly involved in doing it, and that it does it all the time, 24/7. So when we finally produce something, it all comes like in this very dense kind of thing that's been like kind of, we've been cogitating without really realizing we've been cogitating. It just comes into this very dense network because it's already so thick with organization and content. So I think it's very linked to the NI thing. I wouldn't be surprised if INTJ writing was quite dense, and I think it is also. So I agree with you. It tends to be quite dense. There could be worse things about, to describe someone's writing.
Well, all the great philosophers have dense writing, so it's a compliment. It's like someone telling you you're the people that you admire. It's like, thank you. I have the traits of the people that I find cool. Great.
If it can have 5% of the traits, that's already fantastic, because I do like I have to say, and perhaps this was an unconscious decision on my part. It certainly wasn't conscious, but perhaps it was still a decision that was unconscious. About the relative brevity of the book is that some of my favorite books, philosophically speaking, are short and dense. Like they pack a serious punch, but they don't stick around forever packing it. And I love that about those books, and perhaps in a certain sense, I was trying to do the same thing.
Yeah, you succeeded.
Yes.
Yeah. You can be in the Hall of Fame with the other philosophical writers that you love so much. So, another.
You will decide. Me to decide.
That's true. And so another concept that you talk about in this book too is dualism and monoism.
Mm-hmm.
And so you tackle it within the framework of existentialism, I believe. So I'm wondering about your thoughts there.
All right. So I like the challenge that you're confronting me with, Joyce. Jumping straight from chapter 2 to 5. Okay, let's do this. This book, I think I could just about manage it. So this is a speculative claim, but INFJ is low speculation. Speculation is good. It's creative. We need to constantly be asking ourselves questions and attempting answers. And dualism and monism are, and maybe some of our viewers will not be familiar with those terms. I'm sure many will, but maybe not all of them. So I think in the simplest possible terms, and you don't need, this is not just a philosophical notion. Everyone in the world has a worldview, which is either monistic, dualistic, or pluralistic. So pluralistic just means more than two. So in the best way to describe it is to say, if someone considers that reality consists ultimately of just a single thing or substance, they're monists. Monism. If they think it consists fundamentally of two substances, two domains, then they're dualists, and pluralists more than two domains. I think the majority of the population probably falls into one or two, even though a lot of people might think, oh no, it's more than two. But actually, what I found is when I talk to people who define themselves as pluralists according to these definitions, what happens is it turns out that what they thought were three basic things or four basic things can actually be reduced down to two or sometimes one. So just to give as clear an example of a very famous dualism is the dualism of Christianity. So the kingdom of the earth, the terrestrial, and the kingdom of heaven. So that's an example of a dualism. That's what we could call a metaphysical dualism, dualism about the nature of reality. We have our earth, we have our corporeal, finite, mortal beings here, and then in heaven, incorporeal, infinite, timeless, perfect. So dualism. So notice one thing: any committed Christian is a dualist. So that's already a lot of dualists. Now, you can also be a dualist in what we call epistemology, or in the theory of mind. It has metaphysical impact. So, for example, you could think that there's two substances. It's not the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of the earth, or the earth and heaven, because maybe you're more secular, maybe you're not that much into religion. But you think that mind and matter, the body and the psyche, cannot be reduced to each other. They're fundamentally different things. So my body, and maybe this book, it's part of the same kind of matter, different types of matter, but it's matter. But my mind, when I have an idea, when I have a vision, when I have an insight, when I have an intuition, it seems to be more than that. Can it really be reduced to just wirings of my brain, or is it more than that? Can we really say that the feeling of love is like, chemical interactions in my brain? If we think it's more than that, if we think that there's something non-material about it, then we're dualists again. A monist might say, a monist could be a hardline materialist scientist. So thinks, no, we can reduce everything, even love. You think it's love, you think it's really deep. Actually, it's just, chemicals in your brain operating a certain way. It's all just physical. That's a form of monism. But maybe there's like other forms of monism that are a bit more exciting from an INFJ perspective. One that's quite common these days is what I call panpsychism. Everything is consciousness. So actually, like this material world, it's not actually the ultimate reality. It's a manifestation of that reality, but reality is just pure, ubiquitous consciousness. That's monism too. And so I had to define those categories in this video, but also in my book, because I make the later points that depending on where an INFJ will be situated in terms of their alienation, that will have an impact on their worldview. And more specifically, I think that the more alienated the INFJ, the more likely, and again, it's not meant to be a negative term, the more likely their viewpoint will be dualistic. And the more vocational the INFJ, and vocational is the term I use to suggest another mode of existence than alienation. It's not our basic mode of existence, but we can, through various activities and utilizing of the FE function and TI and a certain mode of existence oriented more toward others, we can achieve a vocational mode of existence. I think the more vocational the INFJ, the more likely the worldview will be monistic. And the reason is I suggest that INFJ or not, nobody can really live with too much of cognitive dissonance. In other words, your values cannot conflict too much with your most innate tendencies. In other words, if someone feels very alienated and feels a profound separation between their body and their minds, as if the body is somewhere very, very distant from their immediate experience and the world as a material substance is very distant, they're very likely to have a worldview which justifies this dualism. If they feel more integrated and the vocational type of existence involves this type of integration, monism is likely to follow. And in the book, I provide examples drawn mostly from philosophy of how this is illustrated. And I think part of what makes my argument compelling is that when you have a very alienated philosopher, INFJ philosopher, let's say, they tend to be almost invariably dualistic. But I think what makes my argument compelling is that it doesn't stop there, is that you'll notice that almost systematically, they'll say, yeah, two worlds, two substances, but they always prefer the mind. And I think they prefer it because that's their NI. That's what they know. And they need to prefer it because that's where home feels. You don't see that valuation, overvaluation of mind and devaluation of body in the monistic versions. So again, that's a speculative argument, but I think it's well worth thinking about. I don't know, Joyce, if you consider yourself vocational or alienated, or if you're monistic or dualistic, but again, food for thought. In fact, I'm honest enough in the book to say that I personally, I'm not quite at the level where I'm monistic. So again, this is not a declaration of my ultimate wisdom. It's just an as honest as possible analysis of the consciousness of the INFJ.
Yeah, it's very relatable how you talked about the devaluation of the body and the overvaluation of the mind. That yeah.
That's philosophy. It's everywhere. The philosophy.
Yeah, and so it's very well outlined in Ren's book. Many things are well outlined in Ren's book. And so, Ren, I'm wondering about what concepts you love the most out of your book. So what are some things that we haven't touched on yet that you really emphasize in the book that you wish people would take away if they were to read it?
Well, thank you for giving me that opportunity and asking that question. So maybe I'm going to pick two themes, and I'm going to pick those not only or not really because I'm more proud of them than other concepts, but because I think they can actually be immediately practical to INFJs and can make a difference in their lives quite directly beyond all the philosophical abstractness of the book. So I'll start with And these two themes are connected. So the first theme is unhealthy versions of alienation, which I call the dismissiveness and evasiveness. So the evasive INFJ and the dismissive INFJ. So I'm talking about two modes of existence. So it's not about people who are by temperament evasive or by temperament dismissive. It's that they consciously are not made the choice to be that way. These are possible choices that emerge out of, I think, a misguided attempt to deal with alienation, but not in the right way. So evasiveness is over-reliance on the FE function. If I were to put it crudely, evasiveness. Dismissiveness, over-reliance on the TI function. Both are ways of not dealing with a certain level of pressure that comes with the otherworldliness of NI. Because NI has this otherworldly quality, it's actually not easy to relate to people directly. Because NI has this weird kind of thing where it's not a function of judgment, so it doesn't allow you to actually make decisions by itself. But it's still a very, very subjective function. It's a very, very individual function. So it's bound to make you feel like a bit of a strange person, a weirdo, like you're in your own world. And I think that can be a lot of pressure for INFJs. And when you combine it with alienation, it can lead to almost survival modes that can actually turn out to be quite nefarious. Over-reliance on the FE function at the expense of NI. I think we've all met that kind of INFJ before. The evasive INFJ, the INFJ that wishes they weren't INFJ. The INFJ that will spend most of their time trying to find satisfaction in being supportive to others, in being self-effacing, and in berating themselves, really, by just assuming that they're not that unique. So the point is to say that's never satisfying, because you actually are quite unique. Now, unique in an objective sense, not in the sense that you're amazing. You're unique because NI has this very strong individuality to it. So it's bound to be dissatisfying. And the dismissive INFJ is the INFJ that's also finding it difficult to deal with the individuality, the very pure, immediately given individuality of NI, but conceals this by adopting an attitude where they dismiss others before they can even be questions about their intuitions and insights. And so that's over-reliance on TI. And that's actually, I'd say, an even less sustainable position, because TI is more unconscious than FE and an INFJ almost all the time. And it can actually be a straight path to NITI looping, and that's something we want to avoid. Now, the solution is what I call prescience, and that's my second concept that I wanted to discuss in this video. So prescience is what we could call it's basically my suggested replacement for the word vision, because, Joyce, the way a lot of people would describe NI dominance as having a vision, as being visionaries. And for me, that's a bit of a problem, because it puts a lot of pressure on NI dominants who don't feel like they particularly have a vision for the reform of the world. And also, it doesn't seem to be accurate, because so many people, CEOs and philosophers and scientists and doctors, have visions, and they may not at all be NI dominants. So clearly, having a vision is not a privilege of NI users. And yet there's something that seems kind of true about this whole vision thing. So I think that's the better word is prescience. And the idea of prescience is this idea that you come to conclusions and you come to know things without being able to explain how you came to know it. And I think that's an experience, subjective qualitative experience, that a lot of INFJs and NI users experience. So NI is defined by this prescience. You could explain the prescience by the fact that the gathering of information on the basis of which a conclusion will be reached is unconscious. It's done by SE. It's done, we're not conscious of it. So it does seem as if our conclusions or our pictures just come kind of almost like ready-made, and we don't know where it came from. Prescience puts less pressure on INFJs, because it just describes how they relate to the world and how they relate to how they view the world. It's not about you need to have this vision and show other people. But yeah, I encourage INFJs to be eager to share their intuitions, the intuitions of their prescience, with other people, thereby engaging their FE function to become more confident about the value of their intuitions, to understand that in keeping with prescience, what's unique and valuable about their intuitions is it's not as much the content of the intuitions, as counterintuitive as that sounds, as the fact that because an I is so individual, it's going to be original and it's going to stir people. It's going to make them think. It's going to be thinking outside the box. And even someone who may not understand everything the INFJ is saying is still going to be shaken, and maybe they'll have a great idea as a result. And if you see it as a collaborative enterprise in this sense, you can really liberate the NI potential of the INFJ. So that's for the two themes that I wanted to discuss. I think that these two themes are really, really important. And I've had lots of readers who've not just said to me that they resonated, but also that it has helped them. And ultimately, that's what matters the most.
Very well stated, Ren. You really do exemplify the INFJ trait of being an original thinker, because your book is full of original thoughts. Yeah. You have a lot of prescience. Is that how you say it? Prescience?
You know what? I would say prescience, but actually it could be prescience. I'm not a native speaker, so it's not the common words. But I like the fact that it has pre in it. Like it's like something that precedes. It's almost like you have this science before you even have it.
Yes.
And having a vision, it doesn't mean anything. Prescience means a very clear subjective experience. That's why I use it.
Yeah. That is a really interesting way of reframing the visioning that INFJs do. Yeah. And so, yes, there's a lot of prescience in how you're writing this book. It just has a lot of knowings about the INFJ personality. I don't know how I know, but I know. It comes to me from the processing the back of the consciousness material. It just creates this wonderful book.
You got it. It's exactly what happened. And in fact, in keeping with this prescience and this kind of like density that comes out of nowhere because it's been aggregating at the back of I actually wrote this book in 2 months. It just came out. It almost like really just came out of me. Like it was all fully formed even before I put pen to paper, and if you think that it's full of prescient elements, then I am delighted.
Yeah, you hit up all the markers of a good book. And so everyone feel free to check out the Ecstatic Soul. It is a really good book, and I really, really recommend it if you like reading philosophical books too, because this will have a similar kind of feel to it. So it is full of dense, wondrous material, because what makes something dense is that it's full of substance. And so it's just substance laid on substance laid on substance. And so you really offer that with your take on the INFJ personality, which resonates with a lot of INFJs, with myself included. And so I am really happy to have had the chance to talk to you about your book, because you have this very captivating, phenomenological viewpoint of the INFJ personality. And you also are able to reconcile all the paradoxes and all of the contradictions that people typically talk about in the INFJ too. And you're able to put into words. It's like, well, this is why you might be experiencing this paradox or this contradiction. And this is why you're not alone. This is why you're not crazy. And so your book gives INFJs a sense of relief or peace from knowing that they're not crazy, that someone else experiences life the way that they do, or that this is the INFJ phenomenon of being in the archetype or the pattern of the INFJ. And so you give people a place where their struggles can be heard in a certain way too, or that the things that they could never put into words, they're finally put into words, into a great manifesto. And so
existentialism.
Yeah. And so thanks for being the father of Jungian existentialism, because you are the trendsetter to create this new genre between these two things. And so
thank you so much, Joyce, for asking these wonderful questions. I thought your questions were great, and if I have been inspired, it's also because with the way you phrase your questions, you provided me with the opportunity to be inspired, and to also give me a chance to talk about the book. I've been following your channel for quite a while now, and to get the opportunity to finally appear on it and talk about my book, it's been a real gift. And hopefully we'll talk again. maybe about another book, maybe about your book, maybe about a future book of mine. Who knows? But thank you so much for the invitation.
Absolutely. I'll definitely be inviting you back. And everyone, feel free to check Ren's book in the description links below. You will definitely like it, especially if you like writing that goes very deeply into the material. So it's not an easy read, like you just read an article on a magazine. This is something that is filled with attention, care, and love. It's like if you took many smart ponderings and you condensed them all into a book, it would be this book. It's almost like when you have fruits and you dry them, and then the substance is all of the concentrated substance there. So Ren's book is all of these amazing ponderings and philosophical thoughts and intellectual discoveries, and they're all condensed down into his lovely manifesto. And so go give it some love. And so thanks, Ren, for coming out. Thank you, everyone, for watching. I'll see you all in the next episode.
Everyone, bye, Joyce.
Bye.